I drained my entire savings account to put $50,000 into a security fund for my wife, Ava. When my mother-in-law ended up in critical condition and desperately needed the funds, Ava clung to the debit card and refused to pay. She went as far as insulting her own father and refusing to help save a life, even faking a domestic violence scene to try and frame me. Once the truth was revealed, I told her flat out that she would never see a single cent of that money again. In the middle of the night, I received a frantic call from my father-in-law, Robert. He told me that Mary had been in a terrible car accident and begged me to bring money to the hospital immediately. I quickly turned to Ava and explained that her mother was in trouble and we were completely broke, so we had to use the wedding fund I had given her. Ava's expression hardened instantly, and she shut me down without a second thought. She told me absolutely not. She argued that since it was my mother who was injured, there was no reason to touch her personal security fund. She even suggested that I should go and borrow money from my own relatives instead. I stood there in shock, unable to believe those words were coming out her mouth. I told her that this was a matter of life and death, and asked how she could only be thinking about money at a time like this. She just rolled her eyes and told me with total impatience that I would have to write her a formal promissory note first. She insisted that no matter how much I spent, I would have to pay her back every single cent. I was completely paralyzed by her coldness. That money had come from my own hard-earned savings, and now it was being used to save her own biological mother, so I couldn't understand why I would owe her anything. Ava looked incredibly serious, seemingly unbothered by the fact that every passing second was critical for her mother's survival. She marched into the study and grabbed a pen and paper, returning with a stern look on her face. She demanded that I write down exactly how much I was borrowing from her to pay for my mother's medical bills and promised to pay it back. I told her desperately that Mary was our mother too and begged her to stop acting so irrationally. Ava interrupted me with an agitated tone and told me to stop acting like such a saint. She claimed that the fund my family provided was her only sense of security for the future. She accused me of targeting her safety net the moment trouble arose and wondered what she would do if I refused to pay her back later. She told me that if I truly loved her, I would go find the money elsewhere instead of touching her fund. I couldn't wrap my head around why she was being so heartless, so I tried one more time to reason with her. I asked her how she could be so cold as to refuse to save her own mother. Her face immediately twisted into an expression of deep insult, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. She started sobbing and accused me of trying to make her look like a villain. She claimed that I was the one cruelly comparing a human life to her financial security and forcing her to make an impossible choice. She pointed out that I had plenty of relatives I could ask for help, or I could simply sign the promissory note she demanded. My hands were shaking with pure rage as I asked her why on earth I should have to sign anything. Ava's voice grew even more high-pitched as she suggested that my father should be the one to sign it instead. She argued that he was a grown man and shouldn't have to rely on his daughter-in-law's personal money to save his own wife. I forced myself to stay calm and told her to just write the document so we could leave. I promised her that once we got to the hospital, I would have my father sign it and even provide a thumbprint. That seemed to satisfy her slightly, and she sat down to start drafting the note, but then Robert called my phone again. I assumed he was calling to hurry us up, but the moment I answered, Robert's voice sounded completely distorted with panic. He begged me for the money and asked if I could at least send a few $1,000s right away. I turned to Ava and told her that every second counted, asking her to send the money from the private savings I knew she kept. She immediately got defensive again and refused to send a single dollar until the promissory note was fully executed. She kept worrying about what would happen if she never got the money back. There was a long silence from Robert on the other end of the line before he asked in total disbelief if that was really his daughter talking. He was confused about what money she was talking about and couldn't understand her nonsense. I spoke honestly into the phone and told Robert not to be angry, explaining that Ava was insisting on a legal note because she was afraid he wouldn't repay her. He was absolutely flabbergasted that she was worried about paperwork during a life-threatening emergency. I tried to smooth things over by telling him that if he just signed the paper, we would transfer the funds immediately. As soon as I said that, Robert exploded with a voice that was both trembling and piercingly sharp. He called her a heartless animal for acting this way. He was shouting so loudly that Ava heard every word from where she was sitting. She dropped her pen and lunged toward me, snatching the phone out of my hand to scream back at him. She screamed into the phone, asking him who he thought he was calling an animal. She called him a shameless old man and mocked him for not having enough money to pay for his own wife's hospital stay. She finished by telling him she wouldn't lend him a single dime before smashing my phone onto the floor. I scrambled to pick up the device, only to find the screen shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. The screen was completely black and wouldn't respond no matter how many times I pressed the power button. Ava was physically shaking with rage, cursing him and saying how much his high-pitched, shrill voice disgusted her. At that exact moment, her own phone began to ring, displaying the caller ID as Dad. She looked at it with a cold sneer and answered, asking if he was calling back just to insult her again. Before he could say more than a few words, she cut him off and hung up the phone. She turned to me with a freezing glare and stated that since he started the insults, she wouldn't be providing any financial help at all. She told me to go find my own family for the money and to stop thinking about her security fund. I was near total despair, telling her that as a daughter, she was basically crossing a legal and moral line by watching her mother die without helping. She snapped back at me, telling me to stop trying to scare her with legal threats since we had only just finished our wedding reception. She pointed out that we hadn't even signed our formal marriage certificate yet, so the law had no jurisdiction over her. She made it clear that if I kept pushing her, she would leave me right then and there and keep every bit of the fun for herself. I took a sharp breath and reminded her that it was her biological mother in the accident, not mine. She hesitated for a second before laughing coldly, accusing me of lying just to get her to pay for my own family. She argued that if it were really her mother, her father would never have called her an animal. I didn't have time for her twisted logic anymore, so I grabbed her debit card since I knew the PIN and bolted for the door. Ava panicked and lunged at me to get the card back, but I held on as tight as I could. In a moment of pure desperation, she leaned down and bit my arm with incredible force. The pain was excruciating, forcing me to drop the card as a set of bloody teeth marks immediately began to well up on my skin. I clutched my bleeding arm and watched as she scrambled into a corner, clutching the card to her chest with eyes full of defensive hatred. Seeing my dark expression, she had the nerve to demand if I was really willing to rob her just to save my mother. She even mocked me by asking if I would be putting in this much effort if it were actually her mother who was dying. It finally hit me that the entire time, she was under the delusion that it was my parents who were in the accident. I told her that if she didn't believe me, she should just call her parents and ask them herself. She let out a cold laugh and told me she wasn't an idiot, claiming that calling them would just give me a chance to guilt trip her with their help. Without another word, she grabbed a pair of scissors from the table and positioned them over the debit card. I screamed at her to stop, and she froze, staring at me with suspicion. I tried to explain as calmly as possible that this was the specific account we had opened together just for her security fund. I pointed out that I hadn't set up online banking for that account yet, so if she destroyed the card, the money would be completely inaccessible tonight. She glared at me and said that gave her even more reason to do it. She felt that when that old man called her a heartless animal, he should have realized she wasn't the type to just take an insult without retaliating. I was completely broken, shouting that the man was her own father. Ava's eyes took on a manic look as she claimed he was my father, not hers. She called him a shameless loser for not being able to afford his wife's bills and accused us of working together to steal her money. She wasn't bluffing, and right in front of my eyes, she snapped the scissors shut and sliced the card in half. Watching our last hope for the money disappear, I collapsed onto the sofa, feeling completely drained of strength. I sat there in a daze, whispering to myself that everything was over now. She let out a dismissive snort and told me to go to the hospital alone because she certainly wasn't going. She told me there was no reason to panic because doctors were legally required to treat patients regardless of payment. I replied weakly that while they would stabilize her, they would only provide the bare minimum care to keep her heart beating. I explained that without money, We couldn't afford the specialized medications or equipment needed for a full recovery. Even if she survived the night, she could end up permanently disabled or worse without proper follow-up care. Ava just shrugged as if it had nothing to do with her and told me to stop standing around and go borrow money from my relatives. Then she casually mentioned that she had decided not to go through with signing the marriage certificate at all. I was floored by the fact that she was canceling our marriage while still expecting me to find the money for her mother. I managed to ask her why she was suddenly refusing to make our union official. She explained that nobody knew how much the medical bills would end up being, calling it a potential bottomless pit. She didn't want to be legally tied to those debts if we were married. She told me she refused to spend the rest of her life paying for Mary's hospital stay and figured it was better to cut her losses and walk away now. My heart felt like a block of ice as I asked her how spending money on her mother could possibly be described as ruining her life. Ava walked over and told me to calm down, suggesting that since Mary was getting older, a peaceful death might actually be a mercy for everyone. I stared at her in horror and asked if she even realized how monstrous she sounded. She remained perfectly serious, telling me to look at the numbers. She argued that if the injuries required the ICU, the cost would be astronomical. She asked me how we were supposed to buy a house in a good school district for our future children if we wasted all our money on an old woman. I was speechless for several seconds, but what truly destroyed me was her next comment. She told me bluntly that if the medical bills exceeded $50,000, she would have divorced me anyway. Then she corrected herself, saying that since we weren't legally married yet, we might as well just break up immediately. Her words felt like a physical blow to my chest. I realized that if I spent my entire savings to save her mother's life, she would just leave me regardless. I would end up with nothing but a massive amount of debt and a broken family, with absolutely nothing to show for my sacrifice. Just then, her phone began to vibrate again. It seemed Robert had realized he couldn't reach me and had started sending text messages instead. The notifications flashing on the screen were filled with incredibly harsh language. The message called her an ungrateful wretch for refusing to use the $50,000 fund while her mother was dying. He said she was worse than an animal and expressed pure outrage that she had demanded a promissory note for her own mother's life. He finished by demanding she transfer the money immediately or face the consequences. The messages kept popping up one after another, but Ava just sighed and didn't even bother to unlock her phone. She tilted the screen so I could see the lock screen notifications, pointing out how he was insulting and threatening her. I told her he was only acting this way because he was out of his mind with worry about Mary's survival. She just shook her head and told me to never call him her father again, stating he was nothing more than a disgusting old man to her now. I realized then that any further attempt to reason with her was completely pointless. Robert was clearly losing his mind with desperation, and since a life was on the line, we had to find the money somehow. I picked up her phone and asked if I could at least use it to call our friends and family to ask for loans. She told me to go ahead, but reminded me that since we weren't legally married, any money I borrowed would be my sole responsibility. She warned me that if I ended up in too much debt, I shouldn't expect her to help. She was perfectly fine with us just going our separate ways if things got too difficult. I nodded and started scrolling through her contacts until I found her best friend's number. As I was about to hit dial, Ava caught a glimpse of the name on the screen and snatched the phone back. She demanded to know who I was calling, and I told her honestly that I was reaching out to her friend. Her face turned bright red with anger as she asked if I had lost my mind for trying to involve her friends in this. She asked if I didn't have any of my own family or friends to bother. I had to explain that since she had smashed my phone, I had no way to access my own contacts and was forced to use hers. Ava was trembling with rage and called me a complete loser. I looked at her in disbelief, wondering how a woman who wouldn't save her own mother had the nerve to call anyone else useless. She kept berating me, accusing me of trying to drag her friends into my problems just because my mother was dying. She told me this was a family matter for me to deal with and told me to stop trying to blame outsiders. I tried one last time to tell her to stop being so irrational, reminding her that her mother's life was in her hands. Ava just let out a cold laugh and told me I was being very manipulative with my plans. I was completely baffled, having no idea what kind of crazy logic she was using now. Ava continued, saying she saw right through my plan. She accused me of trying to get her to borrow money from her friends, knowing she wouldn't touch her own fund, so that I could later force her to use that fund to pay them back. I asked her why on earth I would be the one paying back her relatives for a loan she took out. I reminded her that she called that money her security fund, and asked if there could possibly be a more important time to use it than right now. She exploded in anger, telling me to stop with the excuses and stating that the money belonged to her and her alone. Her hands were shaking as she opened the iMessage app and sent a voice message directly to her family group chat. Her voice was trembling with fury as she told everyone to listen closely. She ordered them not to lend me a single cent if I called asking for money for the old woman's surgery. She declared that she wouldn't be responsible for a single dollar of any debt they gave me and said she didn't care if the old person lived or died. The group chat immediately lit up with responses. Someone labeled as her Uncle Bill replied in total shock, asking if she was even a human being. Ava shot back immediately, telling Uncle Bill he didn't know the full story and shouldn't judge her. She asked him if he realized that I had just tried to steal her security fund to pay for someone else's medical bills. Her uncle was even more confused, asking why that mattered when a life was at stake and wondering how she could be so petty about money right now. Ava was livid, asking why she should be expected to use her own money for this. She told Uncle Bill she only called him uncle out of politeness and asked who he thought he was to tell her how to spend her own cash. Without hesitating, she kicked her own uncle out of the family group chat. Right at that moment, another text from Robert flashed at the top of her screen. He said he was coming over to our new house to get the money and called her a heartless brat. He even threatened that he was going to kill her for what she was doing. Ava was still busy kicking people out of the group chat when she saw the text, and she began to shake with fury. She didn't even read the full message, just swiped the notification away and immediately dialed 911. While the phone was ringing, she glanced at me and coldly remarked that since he had threatened her life, she was going to report the old man to the police. I panicked and begged her not to call the police, explaining that Robert was just acting out of sheer desperation. I reminded her that Mary was still in the hospital and asked who would look after her if her husband was in jail. She just sneered at me and told me to stop defending him, saying that both of us were equally disgusting to her. She told me she finally saw my true colors, accusing me of being the kind of man who would watch his wife be bullied without saying a word. She claimed that marrying me was the biggest mistake of her life. My own anger finally boiled over, and I asked her when I had ever treated her with anything but kindness. Ava grit her teeth and listed my supposed crimes, starting with trying to take her fund and forcing her to borrow from her relatives. She accused me of trying to trick her into paying my future debts and then trying to stop her from protecting herself from a death threat. She was screaming so loudly that her spit was landing on my face. Just then, the 911 dispatcher picked up the call. She immediately lowered her voice and told them she needed to report a life threat, stating that someone was on their way to her house to kill her. She gave them our address in Savannah, and the dispatcher told her to lock all the doors and stay safe until the officers arrived. She hung up the phone and gave a chilling smile, saying she had no intention of locking the door because she wanted him to pay. I asked her in horror what she was planning. She told me that since he had threatened her, she was going to let him actually hit her so she could show the police the injuries and have him thrown in prison. I looked at her with pure disbelief and asked if she was really crazy enough to send her own father to prison. She became even more hysterical and screamed that I was the one who was crazy. She reminded me that she had already told me not to call him her father because he did nothing but insult and curse her. She told me I was blind for taking his side and said she regretted ever agreeing to marry me. She swore she would never sign the marriage license and that I would never see a penny of the wedding fund again. She finished by telling me that if I didn't like it, I could try suing her in court. Looking at the hysterical woman in front of me, I could hardly believe this was the person I was supposed to marry. Strangely enough, I felt a bizarre sense of relief wash over me. I realized that since it wasn't actually my own mother in the hospital, things weren't as catastrophic for me personally as they could have been. I grit my teeth and told her that was fine, and that first thing tomorrow morning, I would be filing for a court order to freeze the security fund. I told her I would lock the account until she could prove she deserved it. Ava just laughed mockingly and told me to go right ahead and try to freeze it. She pointed out that my mother was the one lying in a hospital bed waiting for that money. So, if I locked the account, I would be the one killing my family's only hope. She said she couldn't wait to see me regret that decision. I had absolutely no idea why she was laughing so confidently. After everything that had happened tonight, I finally saw her for who she truly was. There was no way I was going to marry a woman like her or take on any of her burdens. Fortunately, during our wedding preparations, I had already established a relationship with a good attorney. Back then, Ava had forced me to sign a prenuptial agreement and insisted on having a lawyer present as a witness. According to that document, once we were officially married, all of her assets would remain her private property. However, half of everything I owned would automatically be legally transferred to her name. I picked up her phone and called the lawyer directly, quickly explaining the situation to him. I reminded him that he already had all of our financial information and asked him to draft an emergency petition tonight. I told him I needed the court to issue an immediate freeze on the security fund account. I planned to submit the paperwork the very next morning to get the freeze in place as quickly as possible. When Ava realized I wasn't joking, she just stood there tossing out sarcastic insults. She encouraged me to go ahead and freeze it, saying she couldn't wait to watch the fallout. She told me that freezing the money was still better than letting me use it to save my mother, calling it a worthy trade. My temper flared again, and I shouted that it was her mother who was dying. From my perspective, since she had already decided to call off the marriage, her mother's survival was no longer my responsibility. Ava went ballistic, pointing a finger directly in my face and telling me to watch my mouth. She screamed that it was my family who was dying and told me to stop using my filthy mouth to curse her mother. Even at this point, she still hadn't processed the reality that it was her own mother in the accident. I decided to be as blunt as possible and told her directly that her mother was the one dying. Ava's voice cracked from the sheer volume of her screaming as she threatened to tear my mouth apart. She lunged at me in a blind rage just as I was about to try and explain the truth to her one more time. She grabbed my face with both hands and started pulling with all her might, even trying to shove the broken phone into my mouth. She grit her teeth and asked me why I loved cursing people to death so much. She demanded to know what her mother had ever done to offend me. My mouth was stuffed so full that I couldn't utter a single word, and she used the opportunity to slap me across the face several times. My parents had never laid a hand on me in my entire life, and a wave of pure, unadulterated fury surged up from the bottom of my heart. When I remembered her saying that I would never get a single cent of the wedding fund back, I finally lost all control. I grabbed her by the hair and landed 2 solid punches right on her face. She stumbled back several steps and nearly fell over, looking at me with an expression of total shock. She gasped and asked how I could possibly hit her. I snapped back that she was the one who started the physical violence and asked why I wasn't allowed to defend myself. She began screaming that she would kill me and dared me to hit her harder so she would have enough bruises to send me to prison. She was wailing at the top of her lungs as she threw herself at me, completely out of control. Even though she was no match for my physical strength, she kept trying to claw at my face with her fingernails. I eventually had to shove her away, causing her to lose her balance and fall to the floor. Realizing she couldn't win a physical fight, she resorted to screaming the most venomous insults she could think of. She told me she hoped my mother died on the operating table tonight and hoped her death was as painful as possible. She blamed my mother for raising such a loser and said she deserved whatever happened to her. I told her coldly that it was actually her mother who was the one dying. She immediately screamed at me for daring to curse her mother again. Her emotions exploded once more, and she charged at me while screaming so loudly that her voice echoed through the entire house. In her blind rage, she grabbed a paring knife off the coffee table and lunged at me with the blade held high. I managed to land a sharp slap across her face that stunned her for a split second. I used that moment to grab her wrist and twist it hard to disarm her. The strength difference was too much for her, and she let out a cry of pain as the knife clattered onto the hardwood floor. Seeing that she couldn't win, she went back to her hysterical cursing. She screamed that my mother was as good as dead and that she would be popping champagne to celebrate tomorrow morning. I finally snapped and lost every ounce of patience I had left. I grabbed her by the hair and dragged her into the kitchen, shoving her head down into the stainless steel sink. I flipped the faucet on full blast, letting the freezing water pour over her face to wash out her filthy mouth. She was pinned under the stream, coughing and sputtering as she struggled and cried. I asked her in a cold, steady voice if she was finished with her insults yet. I told her she was the selfish one, pointing out that even if it were my mother, a real husband and wife would always help save each other's parents. Ava sputtered, spitting out water as she glared at me with pure venom, calling me the selfish one. She claimed that if it were her mother in the hospital, she would never have dreamed of asking me for money or dragging my family into the mess. I just frowned at her and asked if she really thought I was stupid enough to believe that lie. She grew more agitated, arguing that a real couple shouldn't be a burden to one another and calling me a greedy pig who only cared about her money. She insisted that if the situation were reversed, she would have been considerate of my feelings. She accused me of not spending a single second thinking about her well-being. I just nodded and told her she better remember those exact words later. Right then, I caught sight of a familiar car pulling into the apartment complex and parking right below our balcony. It was Robert's car. Ava recognized it instantly and began screaming with joy, telling me I was dead meat now that her father had arrived. I leaned over the railing and saw that it was indeed Robert. As soon as he stepped out of the car, he looked straight up toward our unit. Ava threw the window open, and Robert looked up with gritted teeth, telling us to come down and talk. Ava had no intention of talking. She just wanted him to come up and give me what she thought I deserved. She leaned out and screamed for him to come up to the apartment. From Robert's perspective, her shouting must have seemed like a direct provocation. His face darkened with fury as he marched toward the building's entrance. Ava let out a long breath of relief as if she finally had a protector, and she shoved me aside with all her strength. She started crying again, shouting that her father must have seen the chaos in the family group chat. She was convinced he had rushed over because he was worried about her safety. She told me I was in for it now and that he was going to beat me within an inch of my life. I was surprised he had made it here so quickly. With Mary still in surgery and her life hanging in the balance, the fact that he had left the hospital meant he was beyond furious. I realized this might actually be a good thing because I wouldn't have to carry the weight of this disaster by myself anymore. Ava had no clue that she was the one who had brought this storm upon herself. She shoved past me and headed for the front door, her mind already working on how to ruin me. As she walked, she intentionally started knocking things over and smashing whatever she could reach. She swiped the vase off the coffee table and kicked over the shoe rack in the entryway, throwing everything onto the floor. Within minutes, the living room looked like a war zone. It was obvious she was trying to stage a scene to make it look like I had physically abused her. She even went so far as to tear at her own hair until it was a tangled mess, making herself look like she had just been in a violent struggle. She shot me one last cold, dark look and told me I was done for. She mocked me for thinking I could mess with a woman who had a father to protect her. She vowed to make me pay for everything before opening the apartment door and dropping to her knees in the hallway. I could hear the hum of the elevator getting closer as her father made his way up to our floor. Just as the elevator reached our floor, she let out a piercing wail that was loud enough for everyone in the building to hear. The door slid open and Robert stepped out with a thunderous expression. The second Ava saw him, she began her performance. She cried out to him, claiming that I had beaten her because she refused to use her fund to save that old woman. Referring to her own mother as a dead old woman caused Robert's face to contort with a mix of shock and rage, and his fists clenched at his sides. Ava continued to wail about wanting a divorce, swearing she would never give in to my demands. She told him she would rather have the courts freeze the money forever than let a single dime go toward medical expenses. She spitefully declared that she wanted the old thing to lie in that hospital bed until her last breath just to feel true despair. Despite his burning rage, Robert still understood that saving a life was the absolute priority. He suppressed his immediate anger toward his daughter and turned to me, asking where the debit card for the fund was. I simply shrugged and decided to tell him the whole truth. I told him that I'd tried to take the card to the hospital, but his daughter had physically blocked me and then cut the card in half with her own hands. I added that since there was no online access, that money was now completely locked away for the night. Robert's face turned a sickly shade of gray upon hearing this. He stormed toward us with heavy, angry steps. Ava was still pointing at me and sobbing hysterically, bragging about how she had snatched the card and destroyed herself. Before she could even finish her sentence, Robert lost his composure and kicked her right across her tear-stained face. Ava was completely blindsided, never imagining in her wildest dreams that she would be the target of his anger. She collapsed onto the floor, her face hitting the wood with a sickening thud. She clutched her cheek and looked up at Robert with eyes full of terror, stammering out a question as to why he would hit her. Robert roared that her mother was currently on an operating table fighting for her life, desperately needing that money to survive. He called her a heartless, ungrateful wretch for her behavior tonight. He demanded to know if she really thought she didn't deserve that blow for what she had done. She panicked and started wailing that it was my mother in the hospital, not hers, so it shouldn't be her problem. I intervened coldly, reminding her that I'd told her a dozen times that the accident involved her own mother. She went completely stiff, her head slowly turning toward Robert with a trembling chin. She whispered, asking if it was truly her mother who was lying on that operating table right now. She suddenly started fumbling with her phone, finally opening the unread text messages she had ignored. Previously, she had only looked at the name on the notifications without actually reading the content. If she had just opened them, the phone number would have made everything obvious. She asked in a daze if those messages had really been from him the whole time. Robert didn't even answer with words. He just reached out and delivered another stinging slap to her face, asking who else she thought it would be. Ava clutched her face and turned to me, asking if the person who called at the very beginning had also been her father. I told her it had been him the entire time and reminded her how many times I tried to explain that to her. Robert's fury was still boiling over as he cut me off to scream at Ava again. He demanded to know why she had refused to give him the money even after he agreed to sign her stupid promissory note. He stood over her, asking where the cash was now that he had arrived in person. She broke down in a fit of sobbing, confessing that the money was gone because she had destroyed the card, and asked if the banks were still open at this hour. Robert's eyes were bloodshot with rage as he tackled her to the floor, raising his fist as if to strike her again. He screamed at her, asking what kind of idiot thought a bank would be open in the middle of the night. She didn't even try to protect herself from the blows, just wailed that she didn't know it was her own mother, promising she would have sent the money instantly if she had known. The situation was so chaotic that nobody noticed the elevator had gone back down and returned. Suddenly, there was a loud ding as the doors opened to reveal two police officers. They immediately saw Robert over Ava and lunged forward, pinning him to the ground. Robert was startled and shouted out, asking who had called the cops on him. I told him flatly that it was his own daughter who made the call, and his face instantly turned as white as a sheet. Ava was also dazed, crying out to her father that she hadn't meant to have him arrested. She had just thought it was my father who was coming to kill her. She shot me a look of pure venom, calling me a piece of trash and saying she didn't have time to deal with me before rushing to the hospital. Between her sobs, she told me that I had better call every single relative and friend tomorrow to borrow as much as possible and to get the wedding fund out of the bank immediately. I asked her why I would ever do that. She looked at me like I was insane and blurted out that her mother needed the money for medical care. I just shrugged and reminded her that we had already agreed to call off the wedding, so I saw no reason why I should use my money to save her mother. I reminded her that just a few minutes ago, she had explicitly stated that if it were her mother on that table, she wouldn't dream of being a burden to me. She froze as the memory of her own words hit her, though it was clear she was trying her best to ignore them now. She bit her lip and asked what I wanted from her, offering a hollow apology as if that would fix everything. I couldn't help but let out a short, dry laugh. It was pathetic that she thought a simple sorry was worth $50,000. I shook my head and told her that I used to think marriage was about supporting each other through hard times, but she had certainly taught me otherwise. I pointed out that the very first thing she did when a parent needed help was to try and sever all ties to the situation. I told her that a person like her had no right to touch a single penny of that money. Ava was on the verge of a total breakdown, begging the officers to let her father go while crying out to him for help. She was gasping for air as she pleaded with him to say something because their mother was still waiting to be saved. But Robert just stood there with a bright red face, unable to find a single word to say. He understood better than anyone exactly how this nightmare had unfolded. After a long silence, Robert asked her in a low, hollow voice if she had really told me to my face that she would have forced me to sign a promissory note if it were my mother in the hospital. Ava nodded through her tears, promising that she would change and begging him to support her. He grit his teeth and asked what he was supposed to say. He told her that at this point, anything they said or did would only make them look more pathetic in everyone's eyes. Ava's face went completely pale as I nodded in agreement. Robert had clearly realized the gravity of the situation and the shame his daughter had brought upon them. He shoved her away and gave her one final, lingering look. His eyes were filled with nothing but exhaustion and profound disappointment as he turned to walk away. Ava panicked and chased after him, asking how he could leave without the money and what would happen to her mother. He grit his teeth and told her he would go door to door to borrow from friends or even mortgage the house if he had to. He told her to never call him father again, declaring that he refused to acknowledge such a heartless animal as his child. The air in the hallway felt heavy and suffocating. Ava finally stopped her act about domestic violence in front of the police, stumbling to her feet and lunging to grab my arm. She begged me to give her the money as a loan, promising to pay it back because her mother was dying. I looked at her coldly and asked if my mother's life didn't count for anything in her eyes. She was completely frantic now, asking me if I couldn't just be the bigger man and show some generosity. I let out a loud laugh, finding her request utterly ridiculous. I asked her if she thought I hadn't been generous enough from the very beginning. She just stared at me blankly, unable to find a comeback, before rushing back into the apartment to find the 2 pieces of the debit card she had destroyed. She knelt on the floor, desperately trying to tape the pieces back together as if she could still swipe it at the hospital. It was a completely futile effort because she had cut right through the electronic chip. The only money she had left to her name was her small personal savings, which amounted to barely $3,000. That small amount was nothing compared to the cost of a major emergency surgery. She ran out of the house in tears, knowing the hospital would stabilize her mother, but wouldn't provide the high-end care or expensive medications without payment. For a full recovery and long-term treatment, they would need tens of thousands of dollars up front. It was like a heart attack patient being brought in. The doctors would keep the heart beating, but they weren't going to pay for a $100,000 artificial heart out of their own pockets. The apartment was a complete disaster area, leaving only me and the 2 police officers in the silence. I sat down and told the officers the entire story from beginning to end, and they listened with looks of absolute shock on their faces. One of the officers eventually reached out and patted my shoulder, sighing as he told me that I deserved much better than a woman like that. Once they left, I did a quick cleanup of the mess she had made and called a locksmith to change every lock on the doors immediately. After the locks were secure, I went through the apartment and packed up every single one of Ava's belongings, piling them neatly in the hallway outside. According to our prenuptial agreement, she would have owned half of this house the moment we signed our marriage certificate. However, since we never signed it and she had explicitly stated she never would, she no longer had any legal right to be here. From that moment on, she was officially banned from ever stepping foot in this home again. Changing the locks turned out to be the smartest move I could have made. Not long after I finished, I heard the sound of someone fumbling with a key in the lock. When she realized her key no longer worked, Ava started pounding on the door and wailing at the top of her lungs. She called out to me, crying that her savings were already gone and that the doctors had just given her the bill for the next stage of treatment. She begged me for help, saying she had tried to withdraw cash without her card, but the ATM limit was far too low. She sounded like she was losing her mind. I spoke through the door in a calm, steady voice, telling her she was unbelievable for spending her last bit of cash after I told her she wouldn't get another cent from me. I reminded her of her proud claim that she wouldn't be a burden to me if it were her mother in the hospital. I told her that our next conversation would be through our attorneys in a courtroom. She broke down completely, saying she had no other options and was forced to beg for my mercy. She asked what she had to do for me to finally forgive her. I just let out a long sigh, knowing that every bit of this nightmare was a direct result of her own heartless actions. The biggest mistake was her decision to take those scissors and cut the debit card in half. If she hadn't done that, she could have rushed to the hospital and paid the bills long before I could get a lawyer and a court order to intervene. Even without that, she could have theoretically gone to a bank branch tomorrow morning with the broken pieces to report it lost and get a new one. But none of that mattered anymore because the situation had already escalated far beyond her control. In our suburban area near Savannah, there are only a handful of bank branches nearby. I had already called my mother and filled her in on everything. She was so furious about Ava's behavior that she planned to bring her group of retired friends to stake out every single bank branch in the area starting tomorrow morning. The moment Ava tries to step into a bank to access that fund, she's going to find out exactly how much trouble a group of determined older women can cause. She will see just how quickly that money can be locked down and protected from her reach. Once the bank places a hold on that account, that money isn't going anywhere. I sneered through the locked door, telling her that when she thought it was my mother in the hospital, she had basically prayed for her death. I told her that in my eyes, that was no different than if she had strangled my mother herself. I made it clear that we were finished and that there would never be any kind of relationship between us ever again. She was wailing outside, asking if I was truly going to abandon her and cut every tie we had. She kept asking if this was really the choice I wanted to make. Her screams and cries continued to echo in the hallway, but I was done listening. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and focused on the screen in front of me. My choice at that moment was simple. I locked in Talon for the mid lane. The enemy team had almost no crowd control, which made it a perfect game for a Talon main like me. I spent the rest of the night lounging on my sofa without a single soul to bother me, playing games until 2 in the morning before finally putting my phone away. It suddenly dawned on me that my life could have been this peaceful all along. I had taken time off work for the wedding, but now that the wedding was off, those days had turned into a perfect little vacation just for myself. Since I didn't have to work, I wasn't tired at all even though it was late. Once I was sure she was finally gone from the hallway, I ordered some late-night barbecue and grabbed a cold beer from the fridge. As I sat at the table enjoying my food, I thought back to the months I spent pinching every penny to save up that wedding fund. Back then, I was so focused on saving that I wouldn't even treat myself to a decent meal like this. Now, eating and gaming without a care in the world, I felt like I had been given a second chance at life. While I was finally enjoying some peace, things were going downhill fast for Ava. After kicking her Uncle Bill out of the group chat, she was eventually forced to swallow her pride and beg him for money. At the same time, the story of how she refused to pay for her own mother's life-saving surgery began to spread like wildfire among all her friends and family. People were calling her every horrible name in the book, labeling her a heartless wretch. She tried to defend herself, but nobody wanted to hear it. Every time she tried to explain, it only made things worse because people realized she had been willing to let my mother die just to keep her money. Her reputation was officially beyond repair. By the next day, my attorney had already filed the necessary paperwork with the court. Given the emergency nature of the situation, the judge moved quickly and issued an order to freeze all the funds in that account. In order to save Mary's life, Robert was eventually forced to sell their house to cover the medical expenses, but at least she survived. The most ironic part was when Mary finally woke up and learned what her daughter had done. Her blood pressure spiked, so high the nurses were worried, she might have a stroke. She kicked Ava out of the hospital room right then and there, telling her she was a disgrace to the entire family. The legal proceedings went very smoothly, and in the end, the judge ordered that every cent of the fund be returned to me. The judge was only human, and after hearing the details of her behavior, he clearly had a very low opinion of Ava. When I saw her again in the courtroom, she looked like she had aged 10 years in just a few weeks. As soon as the verdict was read, she turned to me in tears and said that no one wanted anything to do with her anymore. She accused me of being happy now that everyone looked down on her. She claimed I had planned all of this just to destroy her life. She even had the nerve to suggest that I had ruined her reputation so that if she ever came crawling back, I could marry her for free without providing any financial security. I just stared at her for a long time, completely dumbfounded, before asking her if she had a literal brain tumor affecting her logic. She was perfectly happy to let her mother-in-law die to save $50,000, only to realize too late that it was her own mother she was killing. By the time she realized the truth, she had already destroyed the only way to pay for the cure. I realized that some people don't just lack love, they simply never truly consider you to be part of their family. In the end, I won back my clarity and my future. I realized that a person who only thinks about saving themselves while their loved ones are dying is never worth your heart or your soul.